Awesome, thank you. All right, good evening. We're going to begin here in 30 seconds. Please ensure your cell phones are off or on silent, and council members ensure that your microphones are turned on. That sounded beaming. No, it's fine. It makes my eyes pop.
Now I'm not going to offer to close it.
It's the top. Oh, the big blind. It's fine.
This one?
No, it's in the back, but it's okay. Yeah.
George, he said it makes his eyes pop for the people at home.
No, I think
Hey, there ain't nothing wrong with that.
Next.
It's the one farther back. Thank you, Jen. Once I get my vision back.
There you go.
I legitimately can't read the paper. Okay. All right. Good evening. Today is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. Today is Monday, October 23rd, 2023. It is 6:03 p.m. Before we begin the regular legislative meeting, we do have individual committee meetings this evening. And we will start with City Properties and Parks with Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Properties Park Recreation meeting October 23rd, 2003 at 6:03, location council chambers. Members, including myself as chair, Mr. Heidig and Mrs. Fry. Other council members are noted, and Mrs. Erica Bailey is absent, and also guests are noted. We have no new requests for legislation. We do have one requested appointments. A letter from Mr. Mayor Judge requesting appointment of Daniel Knorr to the Parks and Recreation Commission for a term starting January 1st, 2024 and ending December 31st, 2028. Is that right? 28? 27? We have 27. For your term? Yep. Okay. So everybody get his 27, correct?
no,
25, 26.
he starts
Yeah,
in
it is
20.
It's 27, I believe. I think I saw
27.
that on something.
Yeah, that's why I caught it myself. So we'll change that to 27, please. His resume speaks for itself. I mean, you got a big resume. He's part of Barberton. You got a history of Barberton. Any comments or questions about that? Mrs. Fry?
I just wanted to say I know Daniel Knorr, and he's been with the parks for many years, and I think he'll be a real asset on the Parks Commission. I think he can help with some of the issues that are going on.
Awesome.
And I will.
You can't hear?
Is your microphone on?
I beg your pardon?
Is your microphone on?
Yeah?
Use your cheerleading voice.
Well, she said she knows him very well, and he'll do a great job in city parks with his knowledge and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll make a motion to call
There you
for
go.
his
That
appointment.
was better.
I will second that motion.
Vote, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. She lost her voice from screaming at the Browns game last night. That's what it is.
I hate the Browns. I do.
She's not going for re-election, so that's all right. She's
Right.
Right, let out. All right. Any remarks or miscellaneous discussion? Questions? Yes, sir, Mr. Beer.
Just wanted to make a comment. I'm getting a lot of positive feedback about the skate park.
Yes.
A lot of positive feedback.
That's right.
Thank you, Chair. And to President Greer's remark, when a couple of us were at the Co-Park grand opening, I drove by and there was already 6 youngsters using that skate park, so it's already getting its money's worth.
Stop.
Thanks. I do have a question about the skate park and the restrooms. Are those done? Not yet? Okay. I did receive some questions as to why they're not open yet, and I said, I'm not sure that they're finished, so.
And once they are opened, we're hooking up the utilities, the last bit of plumbing, unfortunately, as soon as they're hooked up and be tested, it's getting cold out. We're gonna have to winterize them for the year, so they'll be opened with the rest of the
next year.
restrooms as soon as weather is available in the spring.
Okay, and once those are open, are they gonna be for certain hours?
Yes, daylight.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other miscellaneous? Okay. Nope. Good. All right, motion to adjourn, please.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
All right, we're adjourned at 6:07. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Next up is Public Welfare and Safety with Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. The time is 6:07 PM. It is Monday, October the 23rd, 2023. We're in council chambers. All members of my committee are present, which is myself as chair, Mr. Griffin, and Mrs. Coburn. All other council members are here with the exception of Mrs. Bailey, who is absent. All other guests are noted on my sheet. There are no new requests for legislation, and we have two pieces of pending legislation which will be voted on this evening. The first is an appropriation for the fire department, an ordinance appropriating $1,383.43 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the fire department's operating budget and declaring an emergency. This $1,383.43 was a reimbursement from Noble Oil for work that the fire department did with the oil spill in the Tusk River. The next piece of legislation that will be on the agenda for this evening is an appropriation for the police department, an ordinance appropriating $7,500 from the One Ohio Fund to the police department's operating account in the One Ohio Fund and declaring an emergency. This particular amount is for trauma-informed resiliency, health, and wellness training. It is for the officers that are fatigued, and it teaches them how to deal with that. Is there any miscellaneous discussion for public welfare and safety for this evening? No. Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Motion made by Mrs. Coburn, seconded by Mr. Griffin, and we are adjourned at it's about 09. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fry. Next up, Rules Marketing Development, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to call this meeting to order today, October 23rd. We're meeting in council chambers. All members are present, and all committee members, plus our guests as noted. Tonight we have no requests for legislation. Do we have any miscellaneous discussion for rules? Anything from my body? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson.
I will second that.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde. We're adjourned at 6:10. Thank you. With that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Next up, City Utilities, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call to order City Utilities. I am chairman, and Carol Fry is second, and Erica Bailey is absent. We have no requests for legislation. We have a pending legislation for authorized payment to Lambton Companies Parent Electric, an ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Lambton Companies Parent Electric in the amount of $14,037.08 for additional work completed with the lighting upgrade at the sports complex field and declaring an emergency. Is there any miscellaneous discussion for utilities? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
And I will second it. We are adjourned at 6:10. Oh.
It's very 6:10 or 11.
6:10.
That clock's wrong. Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn. Next up is Finance and Personnel with Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance and Personnel, it is Monday, October 23rd, 2023. It is 6:12 in council chambers. The committee is present, which consists of Councilors Coburn, Thompson, President Greer, myself as chair, and the rest noted. This is a legislative night, so we reserve any requests for committee of the whole. We've already completed the financial report. So for pending, we have 134, 2023, appropriating $1,383.43 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the fire department's operating budget, declaring an emergency. This was referred from safety. Are there any comments? Next, 135, 2023, appropriating $877,500 from the unappropriated item of the FEMA fund to the capital budget of the water department FEMA fund and declaring an emergency. Are there any comments here? 137, 2023, appropriating $294,224.45 from the unappropriated item of the CDBG fund to the planning department's budget of the CDBG fund and declaring an emergency. Any comments? Next, 138, 2023, appropriating $7,500 from the One Ohio Fund to the police department's operating account in the One Ohio Fund and declaring an emergency. Anybody think of anything in the last 3 minutes? Finally, 129, 2023, resolution of the Council of Barberton to support and authorize the mayor to apply to the Barberton Community Foundation for a grant in the amount of $1,600,000 annually for 25 years. Are there any comments here? Counselor?
Any updates?
Mayor, have you heard from the foundation about any workshop? I know you said they were unavailable for next Monday.
Right, no, I'm not.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, is there any miscellaneous discussion? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:15.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our individual committee meetings. We're going to take a short 3-minute break and come right back. Hey, I'm going to adopt it. And we'll come back and start the regular legislative meeting. I just have to check a few things. All right, we're going to begin here in 30 seconds.
Are you sure?
I had faith she heard it. Yes, I am sure. Just got to keep it together. All right, today is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. It is Monday, October 23rd, 2023. I call this meeting to order at 6:20 p.m. All right, yep. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation with Mrs. Angeloff. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, we ask that you guide us in having a successful meeting by helping us use our best skills and judgment. Give us the freedom to speak the truth boldly and with kindness. Give us patience to listen openly. Give us confidence to acknowledge what is right and to explore all new possibilities. Lord, we pray that you bring healing and strength to our families and to help our community with those who are ill and hungry. Bless our leaders, safety forces, military, city employees, and our children. In God's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Mrs. Angela. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey. Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mr. Griffith.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Here.
Mrs. Fry.
Here.
Thank you. Approval of the minutes. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, October 9th, 2023. Sir, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, October 9th, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes from Monday, October 9th, 2023.
All right, it was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, October 9th, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? Did you make that correction? Was that public at all? The October one? So, okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Move on to the finance report. Acceptance of the finance department report for the month of September 2023 as presented. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to accept the Finance Department report for the month of September 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on acceptance of the finance report.
Thank you. It's moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to accept the finance report for the month of September 2023 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, financial report is adopted. Petitions and claims.
There are none.
Matters requested.
They've all been dispersed.
Okay. Citizens addressing council. We do have one. When I call your name, just please step up to the podium, state your name, address, and reason for speaking, and you have 5 minutes. So we'll start with actually there's only one, so Mr. Duplain.
My name's Russell Duplain. I live in Stowe. Don't hold that against me. 356 Suffolk Downs. I work as the IT and facilities director over at Summit DD, but I'm here tonight in a volunteer capacity as part of the support Summit DD group. I placed some materials at your station at your desk earlier, providing information about the levy that will be on the ballot in November as issue number 17. That provides the layout of the expenses, the changes, etc. But issue 17 is a replacement levy, which will value homes based on today's value, not the increased valuation that a lot of people got letters about starting in 2024, so it'll be at the time of the election. The replacement versus a renewal will result in $3.58 more per month for every $100,000 of value. So that's about $43 a year difference in the replacement levy that is on the ballot. It's issue 17. You may have seen, if you had seen what we were doing a couple years ago at our facility, we did a major renovation there. It used to be a workshop. We put about $3 million into that facility to redesign it into office and meeting spaces so that we could transform from what we used to do, providing direct services, to more of an overseeing role. And that allowed us to have about 87 employees that are assigned to that Barberton facility, just down the road across from the Y. That was important for us because we had to transform. We used to have 11 sites around the county, and now we just have 2, one in Cuyahoga Falls and one right here in Barberton. We felt those were good locations for us to operate out of, kind of spread ourselves to the north and south ends of the county. For us, that resulted in about $600,000 a year in operating expense reductions, which allows us to reinvest in services for the people that we support. Despite that, because we serve about 100 additional individuals every single year, we are at the point where we're looking to do a replacement. So same millage, but reestablishing the values. And to clarify, the money we invest in the facility was based on one-time income, not operating expenses, even though it helped us save money in the operating fund. Overall, as you can see in some of the materials, we support about 5,000 adults and children throughout the county, roughly 300 of which are right here in the city of Barberton. So I just wanted to share that information and bring the printed materials, since we didn't have those last week when it was in committee. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duplan. I definitely appreciate the follow-up. All right. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 134-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry and Mr. Hyde. Title, Appropriation Fire Department. An ordinance appropriating $1,383.43 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the fire department's operating budget and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Councilor Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 134-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 134-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 135-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Appropriation Finance Department. An ordinance appropriating $877,500 from the unappropriated item of the FEMA fund to the capital budget of the water department in the FEMA fund and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 135, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 135-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Frye.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 136-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn. Title, Authorized Payment, Lampion Companies, Param Electric. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Lampion Companies, Param Electric, in the amount of $14,037.08 for additional work completed with the lighting upgrade at the sports complex field and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Frye?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Frye to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 136, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Frye?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Frye to adopt ordinance number 136-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 137-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Appropriation, Finance Department. An ordinance appropriating $294,224.45 from the unappropriated item of the CDBG fund to the Planning Department's budget of the CDBG fund and declaring an emergency.
Tongue twister. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 137, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 137-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 138-2023, presented by Mrs. Frye and Mr. Heidick. Title, Appropriation, Police Department. An ordinance appropriating $7,500 from the One Ohio Fund to the Police Department's operating account in the One Ohio Fund and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Frye.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required from by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 138-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 138-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 139-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, Change Order, Parent Asphalt and Concrete. An ordinance authorizing a change order for additional road pavement related to East Houston Sewer in an increase amount of $59,700 with Parent Asphalt and Concrete. Ordinance number 69-2023, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Thank you. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance 139-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt ordinance number 139-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 140-2023, presented by Mrs. Bailey. Title, Support for Issue 17, County of Summit Developmental Disability Board. A resolution declaring it necessary to support Issue 17, Summit DD 6-year replacement operating levy, and ensuring that over 5,000 children and adults in our community continue receiving mandated and necessary services throughout this current decade, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second the motion for suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for adoption of ordinance into Resolution 140-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Angeloff?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt Resolution 140-2023.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt resolution number 140-2023. Are there any remarks? Just real quick, just pointing out that since Mrs. Bailey wasn't here and that was her thing, just noting that it was a change on chair and co-chair on that call. Motion for adoption, or please call the roll on adoption. Oh, I almost got ahead of myself.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 141-2023, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, zoning map amendment, former Oakdale site. An ordinance denying the rezoning of the former Oakdale site, parcels number 01.17406, 01.17407, 01.17408, 01.17409, 01.17410, 01.17411, 01.17412, 01.17413, 01.17414, 01.17415, 01.17416, 01.17417, 01.17418, 01.17419, 01.17420, and 01.17421 to RM18 residential multifamily. This will go for 3 readings. This is the first reading. And this ends the reading.
Good job. Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Resolution number 129-2023, presented by Mr. Heidel. Title, grant application. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton supports and authorizes the mayor to enter into and to apply to the Barberton Community Foundation for a grant in the amount of $1,600,000 annually for 25 years. This is the second reading. The first reading was on October 9th, 2023, and the third and final reading will be on November 13th, 2023. And this ends the second readings.
Thank you. Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
All right, miscellaneous and unfinished business. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to motion to excuse Councilor Bailey from this evening's meeting.
Thank you. Is there a second to excuse Mrs. Bailey from this meeting? Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Bailey's absence.
All right, motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to excuse Councilwoman Bailey from today's meeting, Monday, October 23, 2023. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Councilwoman Bailey is excused. Is there anything else for miscellaneous and unfinished? Jeez. Unfinished business. Maybe we do a whereas for those parcel numbers next time. So like, anything from the council? Anything from department heads? I have one thing. Next week is a 5th Monday, so we don't have council. Next council meeting will be, excuse me, the 6th, November 6th. And with nothing else, communication from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Change for change, I want to thank everyone who came down for that this past week. Over $270 raised from the Down Syndrome Association of Northeast Ohio. Next change for change will be at the Green Diamond, benefiting the Jack Reynolds Memorial Classic Stroke Awareness Fund. As mentioned earlier, dedication of the tennis court at Brightenstein Park and the pickleball courts at Andrews Park and Tuscarora Park happened this past week. The last park we visited was Tuscarora Park. Upon arriving, there were people actually playing, and I drove through the park probably around 4:30. That was about 2 o'clock. Drove through the park around 4:30, received a message that 59 people had already signed up for the Magic City Tuscarora Park Pickleball Group, which is not affiliated with the city, but a group that is getting together to play there. So, huge turnout. Also, as mentioned, the skate plaza was a huge hit this weekend. So whether it's foot scooters or bicycles or skateboards, I even saw someone with roller skates on. It it was packed all weekend. So I actually attended a Halloween party at the dog park, and it was, the fear is that there's going to be some issues between the dogs and the skateboarders and the noise and things. No issues at all. The dogs didn't care about the skateboarders or the bicyclists, and they didn't care about the dogs. So they coexisted pretty well. So I want to thank everyone at Decker Park with the dog park who invited me to come down, be a part of it, and everyone who participated as well. So, I want to also thank Mr. Bob Schneider from the Historical Society and Councilman Griffin for hosting the downtown walking tour last week. Very informative, a lot of history of downtown, the downtown area and the entire city. Barberton held their bingo fundraiser last week as well. Great turnout for great cause there. Also last week I attended a homeless roundtable discussion at the Haven Arrest. A lot of good discussion and ideas with a lot of kind of major players in the region. So glad to be a part of that. We'll continue with our task force here locally, which includes some of the people who were at the roundtable discussion up in Akron. Had the grand opening of Main Street Barberton last week. Going to be obviously a great asset moving the downtown forward as we help them, the city, and the foundation as well. With that, this Friday is our first event, the fourth Friday event. So hope to see everyone down there. As you may recall, we started this pre-COVID, and pretty good success, and then COVID hit, and so it's nice to see this come back to life. So, also with ribbon cuttings this earlier today, we had the grand opening of Co-Parks on Norton Avenue. So I want to thank my staff, Councilman Heidig, Councilwoman Fry, and Angela for attending as well. So great comments from the regional manager who was there. And look forward to continuing to work with them, especially with our safety forces as they do some joint projects. So I'll be reaching out to the chiefs on that. And then finally, trick or treat is this Saturday, so be mindful of the kiddos running around, going door to door. Any questions for me? Yes.
I think I saw you playing pickleball with your tie on.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, okay.
Yeah.
You look like.
We didn't keep score, so
Yeah.
it's not a good record for us. Yes. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidig.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adjourn.
Thank you. Is there a second? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidig's motion to adjourn.
All right. It was moved by Mr. Heidig and seconded by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Didn't think so. This meeting